Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of Root Causes, a Not My Generation podcast.
The podcast that hopes to bring a national discussion on the differing intersections of the fight to end gun violence. This is your host, Addison Moore.
And Elijah Nichols.
From DC.
Welcome to Root Causes.
Today, we will be discussing pride, resilience, and LGBTQ advocacy with Jason Lamar Walker and Brandon Wolf.
How about you both introduce yourselves? Can you tell us a little bit about your work, about your life?
First, thank you to Not My Generation for inviting me to be a part of this conversation in this podcast. I'm very honored to be here and to contribute and share the work that we're doing together to collectively heal our communities. My name is Jason Walker. I'm originally from Washington, D.C., but I reside in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, where I do community organizing work. I've been doing social justice organizing for about 15 years now, organizing very young when I was 17 in Washington, D.C., making sure that inner city youth, Black kids in particular, have access to collegiate debate. From that, I started organizing on my college campus at the University of Louisville, was president of the NAACP, and started organizing around police violence in our community. I also started Blackout, which was our intersectional social justice organization organizing Black queer youth, making sure that we have space in Black spaces and in queer spaces in Kentucky. That work then brought me to New York City, where I started to organize homeless people living with HIV/AIDS, making sure that homeless folks living with HIV/AIDS have access to stable and affordable housing as that's key to folks' health. That then allowed me to launch off and started organizing LGBT youth around housing issues, right? We wanted to make sure LGBT young people had access to safe housing and safe shelter because the streets can be very unsafe and dangerous for queer kids, particularly trans and gender nonconforming folks. So a lot of my work is rooted in direct action organizing, centering on the experiences of folks who live on the intersection of their queerness and their Blackness.
And thank you, Elijah and Addison, for having us on today. I'm really excited to have the conversation. I'm honestly really excited to hear voices that are not my own. I live in my own apartment, and COVID-19 means I'm very frequently talking to myself. So appreciate you allowing us some space to dialogue on these really important issues. 4 years ago, this was not the work that I was doing. This was not the life that I was living. I was not involved in organizing. I wasn't involved in advocacy. In fact, I would say that at that time in my life, politics felt far away. It didn't really feel like my responsibility to lift up my community because for so long, I didn't feel like I had a community. I appreciate that Jason talked so much about intersectionality. For me, intersectionality was a struggle for almost my entire life. And so when I turned 20 years old, I moved from the West Coast. I moved from Portland, Oregon, where I grew up, 3,500 miles to Orlando, a place that I had never been before, packed 2 suitcases and went in search of an identity, a community that I could call my own. I remember how lost I felt when I got here to Orlando. I remember how overwhelmed I felt experiencing culture and society in a way that I never had before. But I also remember for the first time feeling like I was finding what it meant to be me, and truly all of me, not just Black enough for some spaces, but not for others, not just white enough for some spaces and not for others, certainly not straight enough for any space that I could find, but finally finding a space where I could just be all those parts of myself and feel really comfortable. So I found that in Orlando. And in 2014, I met my best friend, Drew, and he changed my life. He was half Japanese, half Finnish, and really proud of that. He was passionate about his beliefs. He was passionate about giving back to the community. And he taught me a lot about challenging my worldviews and interrogating reality and understanding what it meant to be proudly yourself, proudly intersectional, and proudly and unashamedly have the views that everybody deserves dignity and respect. And so we became really close. They say in adulthood that when you've found a friend you can travel with without wanting to kill each other, that's when you know it's a best friend. And Drew and I found that. We started traveling the country together. Every New Year's Eve, we would pick a new city and go to it and just experience it, sometimes places we had never been before. And in 2015, he met his partner, Juan. We kind of became this Three Musketeers act, right? I moved in next door to the two of them. And for me, that was a rival in life. That's a reason that politics and community and organizing felt so far away, because for the first time, I really felt like I actually belonged in my community. I felt like I had a chosen family. I had my own apartment for the first time. And for me, ordinary was beautiful because that's all I'd ever wanted, was to be ordinary and to feel ordinary in the world. In our community, we call June 11th of 2016 the last normal day. And I remember it really well. It was Saturday. It was laundry day. I remember I was knee deep in socks and underwear. I also remember that Drew and Juan, who were extremely photogenic, almost like offensively so, had taken a date to SeaWorld. And so I was like angrily liking every Facebook photo of how cute they were in front of roller coasters. And I remember at the end of the day doing what we always did, which is circling the wagons and deciding to go for a drink to unwind from the week. I remember making drinks at my apartment. I remember calling an Uber. I remember deciding to go to the place that was closest. And I remember pulling up to Pulse nightclub on the night of June 11th, 2016. I remember the line outside. I remember the same angry drag queen who always took my $5 at the front door was there as usual. I remember how busy it was. I remember ordering the same drinks we always ordered. Everything about it was ordinary. And just like always, politics felt really far away. I remember in normal fashion, Drew had a master's degree in clinical psychology. And after 2 or 3 cocktails, he would give you these free therapy sessions. So that night's therapy session was on love and community. And he talked about our need to treat each other better. He talked about our need to lift each other up. And he had these long, goofy arms that he would drape around your shoulder, kind of prop himself up, I think. And he did that night. And he said, you know what I wish we did more in the world is tell each other that we love each other. I remember how normal that felt, that conversation. I remember how normal the dancing felt. And I remember stepping into a bathroom around 2 o'clock in the morning. I remember for some reason how cold the water was in the sink. I remember just wanting to go home and crawl into my bed. I remember gunshots. I remember the feeling of fear, of panic. I remember the dozen or so people that ran into the bathroom with us. I remember the decision whether to stay or run and locking arms with these people that I had never seen before and running for an exit that I didn't know existed. I remember the relief that I felt when I got outside and I was able to call my parents again. And I remember very distinctly the first time I understood what heartbreak meant when I learned that someone so full of hatred, full to the brim with hatred, had armed themselves with a weapon of war, stormed in the front door of Pulse, and killed 49 people, including my 2 best friends, Drew and Juan. It was all of a sudden like politics wasn't very far away anymore. All of the things that I'd run away, all the CNN stories that I'd changed the channel on, those were sitting in my lap. And for some reason, the words that Drew said kept playing over and over again in my head that he wished we just loved each other a little more. And so in the aftermath of Pulse, when I saw them erasing the black and brown faces that were largely impacted in the club that night, when I saw them erasing the undocumented immigrant families who couldn't come forward and ask for mental health resources for fear that they would be deported, when I saw them erasing the LGBTQ men who were not allowed to give blood because it was illegal, when I saw them erasing our stories, I decided I didn't want politics to feel far away anymore. So I've spent the last 3.5, almost 4 years advocating for gun violence prevention measures, for LGBTQ equality. I started a foundation called the Drew Project. We give away college funding to LGBTQ young people who are fierce advocates in their community doing the work that Drew would be doing if he was here. And last year, I left my full-time career in business and went to work for Equality Florida, which is the state's largest LGBT civil rights organization. So it's been a really incredible journey over the last 3.5 or 4 years. I'm honored to do it. And truly, I'm driven by this belief that it's my obligation and responsibility to fight for a world that Drew and Juan would have been proud to live in.
I know it's not always easy to talk about these things that are so personal to a lot of people in our community and so personal to ourselves. So thank you both for sharing your stories.
Yeah, thank you so much. So, just to start off with a really simple question, what does pride and queer liberation look like to you?
For me, when I think about pride, like Brandon, I have to think about the movement, right? Have to think about the sacrifice and the dedication, and most importantly, the risk that members in our community had to take in order for us to be able to display our pride publicly. So for me, when I think about pride, I have to think about queer liberation first, because our struggle for queer liberation that we access this pride. So thinking about like Stonewall, And thinking about the Stonewall Inn and Silver Rivera, Marsha P. Johnson, we don't really talk about the homeless youth who slept across the street, who also got involved with the riots, who were homeless at the time, participating in confronting violence from a police state who wanted to repress people's freedom of expression of their love. For me, I start with the liberation effort, the work that it takes for us to get to a place of radical self-acceptance, right? And the collective work for policy and political liberation, for societal liberation and societal acceptance, right? So I believe pride starts here, right? It starts within. It starts with us as being able to self-radically accept not only ourselves, but each other. I think even still, when we think about pride in queer liberation, we still have some internal issues between colorism, fat phobia, femphobia, transphobia that happens within our community. So our pride also has to be reflected in each other. So for me, queer liberation and pride is multifaceted. And it's a conversation that's an internal one, a communal one, and a societal one. But it starts at the point of critical resistance. And that critical resistance, again, is, are we going to resist the narratives that have been pushed on us about who we are and how we should identify? Do we push and resist the narratives that are pushed through public policy that attempts to promote inequity, inequality, barring folks from housing and employment, perpetuating systemic violence in our community? So it's a big conversation. It's a small question, but it's a great conversation. And for me, it's about our efforts to be in solidarity with each other and our allies and our accomplices for the liberation of love. Honestly, it's the liberation to love freely. It's the liberation to show compassion to people we were taught not to love. So queer liberation for me is part of the liberation of our collective and shared humanity, right? So that's for me where I understand, fit, situate, and organize around queer liberation and around pride efforts.
Well, for me, I think pride is a lot of things. Pride is a celebration of the progress that we've made, a celebration of the places that this community has gone. I think a celebration of the resilience of the LGBTQ community over the years. Pride is a reflection on the moments of struggle that we've had to get where we are, a reflection on the people who've sacrificed so much to bring us where we are, the people that were left behind in order for the movement to push forward. Pride is a lot of things, but it's also not lost on me that Pride Month every year is June. And for the rest of my life, for the rest of our lives, Pride Month will not only be marked by celebration and reflection, it will also be marked by the anniversary of the shooting at Pulse. And for me, that is a reminder of the work that we have left to do. It's a reminder that across the country, people are left without non-discrimination protection. It's a reminder that LGBT young people are at exponentially higher risk for facing homelessness, for facing, suicidal ideation, for not feeling safe in the spaces that other young people feel safe in. And so for me, the anniversary of Pulse and the tremendous loss that we have suffered as a community, the tremendous losses that, Black trans women are suffering right now, the tremendous struggle that they're going through, that and pride are not two different things. They're not adjacent to each other. They are the same thing for me, because at the end of the day, pride is not only a celebration, pride is still and forever has been a protest and continues to be a protest, continues to be an unapologetic reminder that we have so much work left to do to demand the kind of dignity and respect that every single human being on the face of the earth deserves. So pride encompasses so much for me. I think, it's all about parades and flags and enjoying our company and our community and the safe spaces that we've created for each other. But I never lose sight of the fact that a lot of people have suffered and struggled to get us where we are today. And we have to do more than honor them with flags and parades. We have to do more than honor them with corporations taking their logos and making them into rainbows. We have to do more to honor them than just talk about things, right? We have to honor every single one of those people we've lost to hate violence, every single one of those people who have put the struggle on their own backs to get us here. We have to honor them with action. And that's never really very far from my mind.
And I think to sort of build on that point, how as young people, like we're put into these situations where we have to recreate gender norms, whether it be through being straight or through acting as this manly man. I think like we're recreating that in our structures because we're allowing for abuse to take place by our police state. We're allowing for abuse to take place within our healthcare system with inadequate healthcare or lack of affordability for individuals. We're recreating this abuse that we've learned at such a young age, and we're putting it into our systems. And I think something that both of you said in tackling not only the societal violence, these repercussions that we're getting as queer people, but really taking the time to dismantle the oppression that we've set into our systems, maybe not us personally, but historically throughout time, you know?
I love what you called out is about the pride that we have to have in ourselves and our community, right? Because I think about my own journey with advocacy and being willing to critically resist the systems and structures that have held us down for so long. I wasn't able to do that for a really long time because I hadn't yet come to terms with what being proud of myself really meant, right? And, a lot of that came from what are the boxes that society and my own community had told me I had to fit into, right? And all of that changes depending on where you are in the country. Portland, Oregon is very different from Orlando, Florida, as is very different from Brooklyn, right? But in our communities, we are pushed into these boxes that define who we are for a long time as young people. And I was incapable of being an asset in the movement, being an asset to advocacy and to queer liberation until I could come to a place of pride in my own existence. And I think we don't talk about that enough. So I really appreciate you bringing that up because we have a lot of work to do, not only to resist the systems and structures. Listen, that's what I do every single day. I fight Republican politicians in Florida for a living. So I understand that part of it. But at the end of the day, the real work to be done and some of the most fruitful work that I've seen is the work that we do with young people, is the work that we do within our own communities to give folks a sense of pride in who they are, to begin to really love themselves truly and deeply so that they can weaponize that love, turn it outward, right? And they can begin to fight against these systems and structures that are pushing that love back down.
I want to add another layer to that, Brandon, because I think this is a great conversation piece. Because as we discuss what does self-acceptance and love looks like, and we think about that a lot as queer folks, we have to, honestly, for our mental and emotional and spiritual health. I also want to recognize and call attention that oftentimes my first abusers, right, were the people that also loved me too, right? So the people who were my family, right, my brothers, my siblings, right, teasing and picking on me because I was feminine or soft, right? Even when we think about the folks who are murdering trans folks are oftentimes the people they are intimate with. And correct me if I'm wrong, Brandon, I think there were even rumors that the attacker at Pulse was also someone who was closeted. I'm not too sure, but I think there were rumors around to that end that this person was on Scruff or like on Grinder or something. But the point is that like oftentimes the perpetuators of violence in our community are folks who are struggling with their own lack of self-acceptance for themselves. And, it's kind of goes like what we used to say as a child, the girl that hits you, she got a crush, it's a love tap, right? Those things like that. I think like we have this idea that like to show affection or care to someone is through violence. And I think that is socialized and normalized at a very early age. Oh, that's just a love tap. She likes you. That's why she's hitting you. We shouldn't normalize behavior like that.
So thank you so much for talking about this idea and about these systems that are oppressing our people, that are oppressing queer people worldwide. We've sort of talked about different ways that queer people are oppressed in different ways that we have systems that are definitely oppressing us in different ways. I'm really curious, how do you believe and what can you tell our listeners about the LGBTQ plus community and how we're disproportionately affected by the systemic and community violence?
I mean, there's so much there. I love how you've got two what seem like simple questions on the surface, but there's so much there. And I need to be clear that I don't yet understand, and I don't know if anybody truly understands the depth of some of this systemic violence against marginalized communities. It feels like every time we peel back a layer, there's something else there. And it's been baked into the system for hundreds of years, right? So I think it's important first to help people to understand that a little bit of what you're saying applies to so many systems and structures, right? Denying access to healthcare to LGBTQ people is violence against the LGBTQ community, right? Weaponizing and militarizing hatred is violence against marginalized people who disproportionately are affected by hate crimes, right? And so these issues that seemingly are not queer issues, when you're talking about gun violence prevention, when you're talking about fixing our absolutely barbaric healthcare system, when you're talking about the criminal justice system, and I use justice very loosely, especially as we've seen over the last decade or so, as videos have started to come out on social media of things that have been happening for generations. When you talk about these issues that on their surface don't sound like LGBTQ rights issues, they are. And the reason is that anytime you have a structure that leans on marginalized people become its victims, right? And so I think we have to have a real conversation about how these systems and structures are impacting people in their everyday lives. I think part of the way that we do that is by lifting up stories of people who've been impacted by systems and structures that are perpetuating violence. I think we talk about, in the time of COVID-19, we talk about doctors who, whether they know it or not, are giving misinformation to those living with HIV by telling them that their HIV status determines their risk for COVID-19, because that's not true. What actually determines risk for COVID-19 is the health of your immune system. If you are someone who is undetectable and is on a medical regimen, you are not at higher risk. There is no evidence that you're at higher risk for contracting COVID-19 than anybody else. You have a relatively healthy immune system, right? So moments like that are where the systems and structures fail LGBTQ people, they fail marginalized people. We have to continue to lift up those moments, lift up those stories. We also have to amplify the voices of people who are being impacted every single day. We have to amplify the voices of Black trans women who are already at disproportionately higher risk of violence, especially from intimate partners. And that only gets worse when you're in a state like Florida that's like the wild, wild west. Anybody can have any type of firearm they want at any time and any place. All of a sudden, you've put that person at even higher risk for violence against them, and that violence turns fatal more frequently. There's a reason that for several years, Florida led the nation in the murders of Black trans women. It's because we have this petri dish of systemic and community violence against marginalized people, exacerbated by easy access to weapons, exacerbated by a shrugging off of hate crimes. So again, I think the question sounds simple on its outset, but the reality is these things are very complicated. The thing I would always point people back to is all of these issues impact the LGBTQ community disproportionately. There's evidence of that up and down the scale. The way that we bring that to the forefront is by finding those voices of people who have been negatively impacted by our systems and structures, bringing them to the surface, amplifying them, using our platforms to put a spotlight on them, and then turning around and demanding a fix to the system that broke in the first place.
So I think about like systems a lot, right? And how systems are created to maintain oppressive identities, and how do systems are created to maintain identities of the oppressor and identities of the oppressed, right? I think we are socialized to be the oppressor and to be the oppressed, right? We understand that very clearly through kind of like a black and white racial paradigm. We understand that a little bit more. I think there's much more conversation about that through a gendered paradigm. And I think those frameworks are a great way for us to access how systems of oppression operate within a queer framework as well. So we could look at like how systems of socialization, right? Systems of normativity normalizes heteronormative behavior, the root of kind of like systemic structures, not just for racial hierarchies and social stratification, but also for queer folks and LGBTQ communities, exists in religious and cultural dogmas that we get very early on in our educational system. I think that in our experience, like our educational system is very gendered. And I think our educational system, we do not talk enough about gender, even though like gender is a construct that we learned very early. We don't have a conversation about that at an early age. And I think if we allow young people to even start to question and interrogate these ideas of gender, these ideas about just being and existing in the world, because we do that, right? As a child, I did it when I wanted to be Superman, right? I thought about ideas of being in different ways. in kind of like my fantasy play. But if we could think about it in ways of like, hey, what are different ways of being and identifying folks? And I think we're starting to see that when we see like kids early on start to transition, early on starting to break out the binary, we're starting to see that. But I don't think we have an educational system to actually help facilitate that. I think the burden of that is often placed on child and parent. And I think like we should really, really interrogate our educational system to see if our educational system can help facilitate the understanding and conversation. And that should not just be the burden of good teachers, the child themselves, and often the times the parent. Because what happens is the child will probably get homeschooled or sent to another private institution. And then public schools start to perpetuating those. And the communities impacted by the public school education system are oftentimes low income communities and communities of color. And we're still caught up in the system of systemic violence of LGBTQ folks. So I think that is through refashioning our educational system and ensuring that quality education also starts at understanding our beingness and becomingness as just children. And also religious and cultural dogma. That's a little bit more challenging to uproot because you can't actually use policy in that regard. But I do think public policy is very helpful for our educational system in that regard, in ensuring that we can have an educational system that diversifies our understanding of gender and sexual orientation.
I love that you called out the education system, because one of the things that happened with Equality Florida, and I think other LGBT civil rights organizations across the country, was they had this inflection point when Pulse happened. And there was this introspective moment that happened at the organization where we asked ourselves, what is the work that we are doing in order to accomplish our goals more fully, right? Are we simply trying to uproot the political system, right? Are we simply fighting these battles in Tallahassee? Are we just lobbying for legislative change here and there? And if we are doing that work, are we really tackling the structures that are perpetuating the kind of hatred that leads to the violence we saw at Pulse? And so one of the promises that the organization made, and it's been totally transformative in the state of Florida, is we made a promise to tackle hate and bigotry at the source. And what that meant was we were going to go into the educational system from the very bottom, from teachers and janitors and administrators and student leaders, all the way up through superintendents, school board members, up to the Florida Department of Education. And we were going to infuse a different kind of culture, a more inclusive culture from top to bottom, on our path to changing the way we view gender identity and sexual orientation in the state of Florida, and hopefully the country as a result. We told ourselves, if we're in 4 or 5 school districts in the next couple of years, that will be a huge success. And they will probably be the same school districts that we would have normally worked with, right? The Fort Lauderdales, the Miamis, the Orlandos of the world. What has happened is there is a fierce hunger for this work across the state, a realization that if we're going to create schools that are effective and truly uplift all students, then we have to tackle these structures of hatred and bigotry and division in the schools. And as a result, here we are less than 4 years out, and the organization is doing this work in 65 of 67 school districts in the state of Florida. And it's now trickled out to the private school systems, those charter schools that many of them are religious, right? And have some of these structures in place that you're talking about that are challenging to combat. So I think what we see is not only is that the way to tackle some of the systemic violence that we've seen against the queer community, is to go after it at its source, but there's also a real hunger for that. There's also a real understanding that young people thrive, society thrives when there is a sense of belonging and inclusion, and we break down these systemic barriers to success. So I think the more that we can do that, the more we can work to reform our educational system to really uplift students, no matter who they are or how they love. I think we're going to see success across the board.
Absolutely. I truly appreciate how both of you are taking the time to sort of tackle this issue of systemic violence in this very abstract way that individuals in the gun violence prevention movement, in any liberation movement, they might not necessarily understand how it affects the queer community. Something I think that is truly inspiring and truly interesting of what both of you said is the fact about how we can be changing this in our local community, starting at the educational system, and how we need to be talking about the reproduction of gender through class lessons, through games that we play at recess time. I think sort of having these conversations within our homes, having these conversations within our schools is a great way to start tackling the systemic violence and the community violence that we see for the LGBTQ plus community.
I think something that each and every one of you have touched on that's really important to think about is like how even just not just infiltrating the education system, but making sure that from the lessons, from the way that they teach, the games that they play, that those influence and affect a way that someone has to interact with society. Because even thinking of the way that cis and hetero folks have to navigate learning about what does a healthy relationship look like, social cues or things like that, it can look a little different because they're able to move freely in the world in that way where they can mess up and it is okay. And I think when you're able to teach folks from a very young age that despite your identities that you hold, despite the spaces that you do take up, this is a way that you can move and move freely. Thinking of an example, domestic violence, right? When you think about it in like a straight way, it's very different in the ways that it shows up in queer relationships. But because youth aren't necessarily taught those things when they're interacting in the world, they're like, well, this, like if there's two men dating, the way that that shows up might be a lot different than the way it would show up in a relationship with a cis man, a cis straight man, and a cis straight woman, right? And I think that when you're able to take this education system and really, show folks this is how you can move freely in the world, it does impact the way that we as a society have the space to give people to grow and to learn and to really thrive in a way that's most authentic to themselves. I think that's really like awesome the way that y'all have talked about that.
And truly, I think this is sort of getting at this idea of ways in which individuals can help one another, help be an ally to the queer community and the LGBTQ plus community as a whole. And it's sort of inspiring me a little bit knowing that there are other queer people who understand that this isn't just a social issue. This is very systemic that we need to tackle our educational system, our healthcare system. We need to tackle our policing system in the United States. We need to tackle our economic structures in the United States and throughout the world, truly, because every single issue is a queer issue. But I'm really curious, is there anything that you would want to tell young folks, whether it be yourself when you were younger or young queer folks in general? Is there anything that you'd want to tell them about understanding their pride and understanding their identity?
That's a really good question because I feel like the thing I would tell my 10, 11, 12 year ago self is something that I'm still trying to tell myself today. And that is to like be unafraid and to like express yourself unafraid, like courageously, like lead. And actually it was a conversation I was having with myself today. I was telling myself I'm gender fluid, right? So my masculinity shows up and sometimes my finer femininity does as well. But I noticed that I use it as safety, right? I understand like sometimes I present masculine for safety reasons and oftentimes I present feminine for safety reasons. So I'm like, am I actually living if I'm only expressing myself through the construct of safety? Am I just living and being through the construct of joy, right? Am I just being and manifesting the beauty of my gender fluidity because I feel it at a time, not because I feel threatened or I feel afraid or I feel scared, but just because I feel joy in just being where I am and who I am at that moment. And that's something that I would have told myself at 5, tell myself at 28. It's something I'll tell myself now. And it's something that I'm still learning because it can be a very scary and dangerous world. And I think like when you are leading, right? And I think many of us are pioneering our identities. Like we are literally pioneering ourselves, right? We are our own pioneers in our own experience. So it is a scary thing. It is a courageous thing to be a pioneer of yourself. And then when you think about, well, I'm the first in my family, I'm the first in my community, I'm the first in my block, I'm the first in my school, it becomes even more of a fear-inducing type of reality and construct. So I think the same thing I told myself 2 hours ago is the same thing I would tell myself 20 years ago. And it's something I'm still learning and uncovering and daring to be courageous about. It's just like, hey, just exist. But the reality of like, hey, someone may attack me is something that is felt. Even though I haven't experienced, I've witnessed it. I've seen it. And I know those stories, and those stories we internalize. And I think those stories is what shape and navigate our movement in the world.
Yeah, I feel like, I'm in a similar place as Jason. There's so much I would tell my younger self. I've been on this journey with myself now for some time, and it's had so many twists and turns that were avoidable. I'm not ashamed of any of them. I don't regret any of them, but I certainly have advice for my younger self. I think one of the most important things to the similar vein that Jason was sharing is I would tell myself that there is no pre-prescribed box that is going to bring you joy. There is no way of being that someone else can force upon you that is going to make you feel your whole self, right? Because I tried all of those things. I tried fitting the not too gay box. I tried fitting the extra gay box. I tried fitting all of these labels that were assigned to me in an effort to find which one fit with me. And it took me a really long time to discover that I didn't match any of those labels because I'm just me, right? I'm a little mishmash of all of the things that people told me I was supposed to be for my whole life. So I would go back and tell myself, there is no prescribed box that is going to bring you that sense of being. And the sooner that you can learn to love all of yourself, every ounce of yourself, the sooner you will realize your potential for good in the world. Um, I I feel terrible every single day that I could have been doing great work for a long time. That I had a story to tell, that I had a voice to use, that I had tools to share with other people. And my search for community, my search for self love and self acceptance so often got in the way of that. I'd love to go back and tell myself 10 or 15 years ago that the sooner you move past that, the sooner you just look in the mirror and love what you see, the sooner you are going to be able to have really powerful meaning in the world. And and never underestimate how you can turn that power into changing people's lives.
Thank you both so much. I love the way that you all said those things. It's really great. And thinking of a lot of queer young people or wherever they are in their journey, I think it's really inspiring also to know that people are still struggling with things that they would tell their younger self and that they would want to tell their older self still. So thank you so much for sharing that with us too.
And thank you both for taking the time to speak with us about these important topics. Thank you for listening to episode 5 of Root Causes, a Not My Generation podcast, where we discuss pride, resilience, and LGBTQ plus advocacy with Jason Lamar Walker and Brandon Wolf. In solidarity, Elijah Nichols.
Addison Moore.
Jason Lamar Walker.
And Brandon Wolf.